very arresting portrait of pre-war Washington, D.C. Now, Reveille in Washington by Margaret Leach, the Pulitzer.
Another of my heroes.
It's spectacular.
Yeah.
It's just been reissued, by the way. But this word portrait that you give of pre-war, especially the slave population that was in Washington, what was it like to be in Washington in those days?
Well, I think we tend to forget, because Washington did stay with the Union, of course. It was the Union capital during the Civil War, United States capital. We forget just what a southern place it was. And, when Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C. in February of 1861, he was very aware of stepping over that line into slave territory. And his first speech that he gave in front of the Willard Hotel was really his first speech in Washington. He speaks to you and the people of your section when he's addressing this crowd of Washingtonians that's gathered outside the hotel. And it's clear that he feels that he is in the South as much as he would be if he were in Montgomery or Charleston, almost. And, slavery was very present in Washington. There are descriptions from travelers of how you would arrive at the depot that was just a few blocks from the Capitol, and waiting outside the depot was a line of hackney carriages, each of them driven by a slave cab driver to take you to your hotel. And these great hotels of Washington Brown's and Willard's were, many of them to a large degree, staffed by slaves. And these European travelers who came there, who had never seen slavery before, would find themselves confronted with it literally within minutes of arriving in the great capital of the world's greatest republic. And so this tension, this irony, this paradox was everywhere visible in the capital city. It was inescapable, as much as they tried to paper over it throughout much of the antebellum period.
But it was there.
It was there.
And did these Europeans look askance at what they saw in the capital of free America, allegedly?
Well, they looked askance, and many of them gloated a little bit, and they said, well, here clearly is the failure of and the hypocrisy of this experiment with liberty. It's not a true republic. A true republic can never flourish, and here's the proof right in front of us.
One of the last couple of slave-holding nations in the world.
It was the largest slave-holding nation in the world at that time.
Well, talking about Brits who came over here, you speak about William Howard Russell, who was on tour and was a witness to the events of 1861, early 61, etc. How did it help to get a British perspective on this, and what was he writing that maybe helped push things along?
Well, Russell was great, because not only did he have this sort of jaundiced eye of an outsider, but he also had that wonderful sort of English journalistic style that I think we're familiar with from our own times, this sort of waspish sense of wicked humor, a willingness to poke fun at his subjects in a way that you didn't really and don't really find in the American press today. So, for instance, he went to dinner at the White House, sort of the first state dinner at the White House, and he describes Mary Todd Lincoln playing hostess at this dinner, and sort of decked out in these two garish, bright silks, and with a fan clutched in her pudgy little hand that she's fluttering this way and that, and she thought she was looking very coquettish, but she just looked very silly. And he said he enjoyed observing the curious mannerisms of this frontier queen. And so he really, he puts you right there, and isn't necessarily flattering towards his subjects. And he did that. He was sort of an equal opportunity cynic. He also said some of the same things about the Southerners. He goes down to Fort Sumter and he interviews, just a couple of days after the surrender, Louis T. Wigfall, one of my favorite characters, a former senator from Texas who had gone over to Sumter and tried to personally secure Anderson's surrender in the middle of this battle. It's an incredible story that I think hasn't really been told very much, but is here in the book. And so Wigfall tells Russell a story about how he single-handedly leapt through the cannon embrasures, waving his sword, and the Sumter garrison fell back in fear and immediately surrendered. And so Russell sort of very dryly tells this whole story, and then he mentions that there was a strong odor of bourbon that hung in the air around Wigfall as he told it. So he sort of casts some doubt on his source.
While we're still here in the boiling up toward war.
Yeah.
How was Union? You speak about how Union was considered in before the war, and you write it was, quote, united by compromise.
Yes.
How did the war? How was it united by compromise, and how did the war change the meaning of Union?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that word union, of course, was one that was a part of our political rhetoric from the very beginning. It became more and more prominent, more important in the 19th century, and Daniel Webster's great speech, Liberty and Union, now and forever one and inseparable. And yet, liberty and union in those years before the Civil War seemed more and more sort of stranded on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm. The more that you talked about liberty, the more you were imperiling the idea of union. Because if liberty suggested liberty for the slaves, that might well drive the South into secession. So people had to tiptoe around the idea of liberty, and keeping the Union together meant one compromise after another with the institution of slavery. But then, in those early months of 1861, as soon as secession happens and the war begins, Union just comes to mean something very different. Union comes to stand for this idea that we are a democracy from which there is no withdrawal simply because you are outvoted. And if these people are if this minority, the southern slaveholders, are allowed to simply sort of take their cookies and go home because they don't like Lincoln's election, that's imperiling the very existence of our republic and the very idea of democratic rule itself. And so that's what this idea of union comes to stand for, sort of a reversal almost in those early months of the Civil War.
Now, do you think the difference then was Abraham Lincoln? Because Civil War could have begun in many different decades prior to this. And certainly the South had been losing its political clout, and that certainly was part of the equation.
Yeah, just the demographics were very important.
And they weren't then. Lincoln and the Republicans stood strong against the nationalization, so they knew they couldn't export slavery to the territories that could become states, and Cuba was taken away from them before that, and not becoming a state because it would be slaves. So was it Lincoln then, do you think, that was the difference in why war came then instead of a decade afterwards?
Yeah, well, I think there's no question that Lincoln's election was the immediate catalyst for war, and that these Southerners did not believe that they were going to be safe under an administration that was controlled by a party that was avowedly anti-slavery. And it's interesting because historians do argue about this more than you might think. You know, since I wrote some of this in my articles on the New York Times online, I actually got into a really interesting sort of email conversation debate with a historian whose work I really respect and admire, Daniel Crofts, who writes about the border states and the secession crisis. And Dan has been, I've never met him in person, but we've had a lovely email exchange, and he said, you know, I really like most of what you're writing, but I have to disagree with you. The South really had no reason to fear the Republican rule. The Republicans were not going to do anything to harm the institution of slavery, and I really have to disagree with him on that. I really do think that the Republicans were a threat. The Republican insurgency was a threat to slavery, and that in a way the Southerners were behaving rationally in a sense to withdraw from the Union when they did, if they were going to withdraw at all. I think that was probably the opportune moment to do it.
Do you think there was any compromise in the Southern leadership at all at that time, that they may have compromised again if Lincoln had the Union, for instance?
It's very
slavery?
You know, it's very clear that for all of the talk and the sort of agonizing debate and discussion within the northern ranks during the secession crisis over how do we compromise, how do we bring the South into the Union, there was really no equivalent debate and discussion among the Southern leaders. They were out, and they were out for good, and my favorite character, again, Louis Wigfall, stood up in the Senate and he said, there is absolutely no compromise that you could propose that would be acceptable to any single man who's white, and he just says these sort of horrible racist things with, you know, no African blood at all that be below the Mason-Dixon line. So there was just this idea that the die has been cast, we have thrown down the gauntlet, and we are founding this new republic.
They weren't talking about Lincoln perhaps not having a birth certificate? So he shouldn't be president?
No. Although, of course, there is a temptation to draw all kinds of parallels to our own times, and one of them actually is the way that, the radicals can end up controlling the agenda within a political party, within Congress, even though, there may be that. I think America generally is a country of moderation, generally a country of a sort of a vast middle, and even in 1860, 1861, I think that was preponderantly the case. Probably, less so than most other moments in our history, but there were a whole lot of people, the sort of center of gravity, certainly in the North, and I also think many people in the South wanted to compromise, but the radicals on either side drove the agenda. And again, nothing like what we're seeing in politics today, of course, with radicals driving agendas.
With Elmer Ellsworth, for heaven's sakes, when he died, it convulsed the nation. What our political problems resulted in a death?
Yeah,
exactly. Of course, before 640,000 more.
Yeah, exactly. And Ellsworth really was one of my favorite characters. A character very close to my heart, very tragic character. Of course, the first great Union martyr of the war, a man who was like a son to Abraham Lincoln. And
it's an interesting. You want to talk briefly about him?
You have incredible Ellsworth stuff here.
We have a big collection up right now.
It's amazing.
From one of my clients that has many different items of Ellsworth, and if you're here in Chicago in the next month, we'll have it up for about a month. Two of them are, here is a song sheet that came out after for Ellsworth, and also Brownell, who became known as the avenger of his death by killing James Jackson, who was the proprietor of the Marshall Hotel. Certainly this did help propel the war.
Yes, exactly. It's funny, now that you mention it, Jackson, the killer of Ellsworth, I was doing an event last night in Maryland, a book signing, and a woman came up to me with a copy of the book to have signed, and she mentioned to me, I'm a descendant of James Jackson, the man who killed Elmer Ellsworth. And I looked at her and I said, wow. And so she pushed the book across the table, and I wrote in it, to Mary Beth, I forgive you for Ellsworth. And I signed it. So I think, it's been 150 years. We can reconcile probably, even for that. But it was this sort of incredible moment at the start of the war where it's almost this sort of simultaneous double homicide where two men, one northern and one southern, fall dead in an instant on the stairs of this squalid hotel in Alexandria, Virginia, a sort of a senseless double killing at point-blank range. Their bodies lying on the stairs with their blood flowing and northern and southern blood intermingling and soaking the folds of this fallen Confederate flag. And this man has been like a son to Lincoln. So Lincoln took this death incredibly hard. Of course, it's remarkable, in those first months of the war, sort of the two of the first great prominent Union figures to die were almost like family to Lincoln, not just Ellsworth, but also Edward Baker, who was so close to Lincoln that Lincoln had named a son after him, was killed at Ball's Bluff in October, and Lincoln was similarly distraught. And so Lincoln, just felt the weight of the tragedy and loss of this war before most other Americans did, which I think is very significant to understanding him and his evolution in those early months. But the death of Ellsworth, beyond its effect on Lincoln himself, just steeled the North, really, not just to go to war, but also to kill. In those early weeks of the war, many Northerners thought that all it would require was a sort of a show of force, and they would go marching through the South with the Stars and Stripes waving, capture Jefferson Davis and the traitors, string them up from a tree, and welcome their Southern brethren back with open arms into the Union. These sort of misled, misguided Southerners. Well, now they realized that it would actually mean killing their own brethren in some cases in very terrible ways.